I want to just reflect a bit on yesterday, but also a bit on what we've just heard, which was a plea for social justice. And both these gentlemen working, particularly Julian, in this area for decades, and we're going in exactly the opposite direction in the real world. There's a total disconnect between the academic discussion of what's required and needed here and what's happening in reality. I mean, since 1970, the tax system in this country and in my own country has gone in precisely the opposite direction. The marginal tax rate for the top 1% in 1970 was 91%. It's 35% today. The corporate tax rate has been reduced. We're not talking about a $200 tax on carbon. That's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because most of us in this game aren't willing to play hardball when it's required. So again, those of us in academia have to get out there and start being real. The academic discussion has to come down to the ground. Now, as for our discussion yesterday, unfortunately there's a filtering system going on. It's just natural. I'm not blaming anybody. But people say really sharp things at the table. They're transcribed in shorthand. They then go to a third level of filtering, and by the time they appear in our plenary, all the good stuff, or at least the hard tacks, have been taken out of the mix. So I think we've got to get around that somehow, so that in the proceedings of this, the hard stuff starts to emerge. So here's some hard stuff. Somebody mentioned overshoot. That's just not a casual observation. Climate change means the human economy is in a state of overshoot relative to the absorptive capacity of the natural system. It's more than 50%. In the last 40 years, we've lost 50% of biodiversity among those species, 17,000 odd species that have been monitored. The world is going down. We can't soft pedal this. So when we're talking about urban sustainability, cities are the place where, in this country, 80% of people live. It's where 80% of consumption and production takes place. Now, here's the hard ball. We need to reduce that. Even the International Business Council on Sustainable Development recognized this in 1993 by 80% in first world countries. Material and energy consumption of 80% per capita is what is required to achieve global sustainability with social justice, meaning a fair sharing of the world's economic and ecological output, by the middle of this century. We're not going in that direction. We saw a 3.5% increase in carbon emissions alone last year. So until and unless your projects and plans are moving us toward an absolute and per capita reduction in energy and material throughput, it's not contributing to the solution of these problems. We need policies that move us toward an absolute reduction. We need the rich to pay their share. This is an unequal society getting more unequal with every government we elect. There's been a complete corruption of the electoral system. It's been purchased by the corporate sector and the wealthy. You vote for people who've been pre-selected to be on the side of wealth right now. By the way, there's an excellent series of lectures called the Berlin Lectures, currently being broadcast from the University of Chicago, on precisely this question, that complete corruption of American democracy by money in such a subtle way that we're not even aware of it. And yet it's what's taking us down, and we're going down silently, nitpicking about kind of, sorry, I get on a rant once in a while, but I'm a scientist. I'm not a social scientist. I've spent 40 years measuring the direction of change, and it is a negative direction of change, and there's no pulling out of this until we get sufficiently engaged with reality and stop dickering around with what could be possible if only it were a different world. It's not a different world. This is the world we're engaged in, and we've got to deal with it on its own terms.
Thank you. So we'll move around. Elaine.
So if this is the morning of truth-telling, I'm going to add to Bill. So I've been involved, I don't know, for about 20 years in environmental aspects and working both on the NGO side and on the side of philanthropy. And now I call it purgatory because I work for philanthropies, but I run an NGO, so I don't know where I am half the time. I will just say a couple of things. I've worked with SCORAI for a few years, and I'm now working with a lot of funders that are really interested in doing some of this transformational work that's really questioning our economic system. And some of them come out of being very disgruntled environmental funders saying, you can fund climate policy out the wazoo, but we are bought and paid for. Our political system in the U.S. is bought and paid for by industry. How can we move forward when there's such a stranglehold? And that's created all the deep inequities that we've talked about a lot the last couple of days. But I also know that we're in this room to kind of connect research to both, whether it's a new economy that we're calling it, or a just economy, or sustainable production and consumption. The thing that I keep seeing is they're all one and the same ultimately, and the language is just different depending on who you're talking to. I will say that I work with a lot of not only funders but with NGOs that are working on really building powerful grassroots movements, and a lot of the stuff that we've talked about here, they've known for a long time. So it's sort of like, I think, and I talk to them about the research stuff, and they're like, you know, there's a real disconnect because they see the researchers as being very disconnected from what's happening on the ground in their communities. And it's partly because the class divide of most of academia is really not engaged, as opposed to people working on the ground in nonprofits or the people representing those communities. So they kind of have a real sense of like, I don't understand, not that they don't think the research is valid, but they just don't see a place. They already know the stuff that I think researchers are trying to find money to continue to study and validate, and there isn't enough time for that. And so what I've been really, after all these years of kind of thinking and struggling about how I can serve the field the best, it's like I'm seeing my role as trying to build connections between movements that are gaining power. I don't know if any of you have heard of National People's Action. Probably not many of you. They're working on really incredible work, and they're actually kind of embarking on a cities initiative. I can guarantee you, I bet USDN doesn't even know they exist. There's Climate Justice Alliance, there's 350, there's the Domestic Workers Alliance, there's all the folks on the labor end that are doing incredible stuff. iGenPoo just won a MacArthur Genius Prize. Totally disconnected from most of the environmental people and from most of the money and politics people, and from other arenas that we haven't even talked about. So I think that I'm putting it out there as a challenge to be like, how, I don't think anybody disputes that we need more research, but how to genuinely connect grassroots folks that really are struggling. Some of them are grassroots, some of them are educated millennials that are, they are so beyond the boundaries, like they are so much more progressive and and get it so much more than my generation did. How can we move beyond the divide that occurs between this research and practice divide? I just wanted to throw that all out there, whether or not it makes sense.
Thank you.
Wow, this is good stuff. I want to start with Bill. I totally agree with you, Bill. We are moving fast in the wrong direction, and we are in a state of ecological overshoot, and we are in a state of increasing inequity, both locally and globally. So, Stephen Moore mentioned overconsumption at a certain point. Julian mentioned social equity. I would like to go to the root causes. I think that the root causes of overconsumption and inequity and poverty are exactly the same. So what we do not need is separate strategies to attack the rich, to elevate the poor, etc. What it is that this neoliberal economic system creates both overconsumption and poverty and inequality. So it is the economic system, behind that is the financial system, and the worldwide financial system is totally out of control. Nobody has mentioned that so far here, and I don't know what to do about it. It is crazy. It is the stock markets, this is the flash capital, it is the speculation, it is the raw materials, it is all of it, and it moves fast into the wrong direction. And we cannot just talk about sustainable consumption without addressing the worldwide economic system. So somebody mentioned carbon tax. It's absolutely necessary. But what are the effects? It creates more inequality, it affects poor people, so what you really need is carbon tax plus all kinds of compensatory policies. And where does that end up? I'm not going too far into that, but we really need to go into a direction of basic income for everybody, basic services for everybody, education, food, healthcare, retirement, etc. A more social democratic economic model. I don't see it happening here in North America because of what Bill said. The political system is totally corrupted, and etc. And we also are in a very state of urgency. We only have a few years to attack this climate change. So everything that the cities are doing are so fantastic things, and so they're all so slow, right? So how do we get this urgency, this systemic change, which is a slow process, this bottom-up grassroots that you are talking about? It's all fantastic, but it doesn't get us there urgently enough. And we also don't want eco-dictatorship. So that is my problem here. I'm very happy to be able to address it in this audience. I have no solutions. I'm very happy to hear other voices.
We'll continue to go around the circle. If some of you start to experience discomfort because it sounds as if what we're sharing at this point is some hopelessness and overwhelm, that's a natural place to be, not only given the subject matters, but the point at which you're at in this workshop. So, makes sense.
So this is starting to sound to me like a Native American sweat. So in keeping with that, let me come back to Eleni for a few minutes, because I think she made a very eloquent statement, and I very much appreciate that. For those of you who may not be aware, that the backstory of this event that you've all been invited to and come to participate in really came about accidentally. Some of us had the good fortune of meeting Babe O'Sullivan at a workshop that was sponsored by the UN Environment Program in Washington several months ago, and it was from there that one step at a time, plans came together to convene this event. Both USDN and SCORAI get by on the basis of huge voluntary commitments on the part of a relatively small number of people. People who are committed to it, people who scrape to find funding in various corners of the world. You serve as the gatekeeper to a large number of philanthropic foundations. What can you do to assist the effort that's taking place here in order to provide the kind of resources that would help to amplify the efforts that are demonstrated by the people in this room?
You want to respond now, or should we go around? What's your druthers?
I'm not. If people want me to answer that question, I can answer it.
Yeah? Okay. There we go. Thanks.
It's not an easy answer. I will be very real about something. I spent the last 6 years running a funder network on sustainable production and consumption, and we had the worst time engaging funders on this issue. And there was a small core, many of you know the story of stuff, and if you haven't seen it, that's what, it's the materials economy. Annie Leonard, original, she was the work group director before me, did this, she was a waste expert for many years and did this On the Show Road, and became the Story of Stuff video. They were completely overwhelmed by how popular it was, and it was very interesting, and I'm going to answer Maurie's question directly. When I came on board, Annie had just left about a year earlier to kind of run the Story of Stuff, and they were sort of like, should we do this group? Should we do this working group on sustainable production? Should we continue it? And when I came on board, I went back to all those funders. There was a lot of funding to make that film. When I went back to those funders, they were like, oh, I just wanted to help support the distribution of this movie. I don't fund in this area. So we spent years trying to engage funders, and then of course concurrently, the climate siren sounded. So we saw this very bizarre yet pretty dysfunctional shift of resources, foundation resources. It makes sense on one level, it went to climate. And so a lot of groups had lost their funding because they weren't working on climate. And then within a couple of years, groups were like, if I'm going to get funding, I need to focus on climate. Whether or not it's strategic, whether or not it contributes to the larger goals. So everybody has had to engage or put climate in what they do, whether or not it's strategic. And of course, there's bigger questions, and I think the professor brought it up about what their strategies have been. We saw the lost COP15 was a disaster. We continue to see the lack of climate policy, effective climate policy, because of the corporate stranglehold for the most part on our system. So I will say that sustainable production and consumption was just, it's not sexy, even though it's completely systemic in nature. It's not sexy. There are some funders that work on tiny pieces of it, bottled water, paper, not even so much on mining. Pew kind of does some work on mining. So it's in some stuff on waste, but it's really a dearth, and it's kind of horrifying. So when I started this new economy discussion group 2 years ago, I saw Gus Speth and Juliet Shore and David Corton and Bob Massey eventually with the New Economy Coalition starting these attempts to really look at the systemic issues. And they all kind of, on some level or another, worked on sustainable production and consumption. It's just a broader frame, and it's looking at the root causes like Philip talked about. And that work group took off, that discussion group. So clearly, we're just repackaging in a lot of ways the work that we're already doing with a deeper and a broader, in some ways, sense. And so I'm hoping that we can bring more resources, but when it's packaged with sustainable production and consumption, it doesn't get traction. So I have been reframing all the work as it's so broad. I'm like, how do we transition to an economy that's just sustainable and equitable? And there's so many aspects on that system that you can work on. So that's what my attempt to do is, but foundations are just as siloed as the NGO world. They, for lots of obvious and complicated reasons. So they like new, they like innovative. It's not always what's best. It's sometimes what's most exciting to their boards. So that's where I am with that. And we're trying to really bring in foundations that are outside the environmental spectrum. And this group has been pretty successful in attracting those foundations. So they're coming from folks that work on labor, folks that work on economic justice, folks that work on environment. We're trying to, and money and politics funders, we're trying to bring more in and connect the dots for them and hopefully bring more resources. But it's hard.
We'll come back around. Vanessa?
A lot of the consumption production ideas are not necessarily on the being flagged for the city funders. So inspired by that, I ended up speaking to the McConnell Family Foundation that we work with, and we're so excited about the idea that they're hosting a Canadian Environmental Grant Makers Network panel where we're going to bring new economy funders and city funders together. And one of the things that the foundation's asked is, from this workshop, are there particular topics that want to be funded that could be flagged for those foundations as being critical areas? So I think that there's a lot of interest. We can just see what emerges here. I'm not, we'll just see. But I think if we do come out with some things, there are foundations on the other side. And I know that's the case. There's a couple of foundations who specifically are looking to this workshop. So one, of course, is the Garfield Foundation. They're very interested, Jenny Curtis is very interested in what's coming out of this meeting. And the second one is Blackstone Ranch Institute, John Richardson, who has been engaged in the local governments and sharing economy workshop. And at the table yesterday at lunch, Rosemary Cooper mentioned to those gathered that if there are cities who want to collaborate together on a breakthrough innovation around the intersection of sharing and sustainable consumption, that Blackstone Ranch Institute has like a pilot grant already ready to go from out of this workshop. So just answering what Maurie's question about are the resources, there are two foundations specifically, but then also these panels that are kind of waiting to hear what comes out of this. And I just want to say as well that I think just about the tempo of change, I think sometimes we feel like everything needs to be at mock pace in order to be responding to the urgency of the issue. But I personally think of systems change as having different tempos. So there's the kind of cultural shifts, which might sometimes happen rapidly, sometimes take slow time. The trust building, like the things we're doing now, that takes time. Grassroots movements might have long lag times and suddenly have a nonlinear breakthrough because something happens. And I would say the same for cities. I actually don't think cities have been moving slowly. I think they've been absolutely astounding in terms of what's been happening within the constraints of their leadership capacity. And there's almost an incubation happening there. And I think a lot about, and researchers can operate really quickly, and researchers can take long-term views of things. So I think one of the things we could play with is more of that kind of pacing, because I think this, this is both a quick problem and a long humans connecting back to nature issues. So I just wanted to kind of note about that. I think oftentimes at this time we get, oh my God, we need to do this fast. And the other thing I think that I think about in terms of pacing is sometimes we think leverage points as doing more of things, like if we just added more power, more push, more this, more that. But in a way, I think there's also a question about what do we want to be doing less of, like focusing less on individuals as a core of change, taking pressure off of things, thinking about using Aikido type metaphors where we're taking the energy from one thing and shifting it into something else, which is what Eleni did with taking consumption and production, which was getting stuck, and shifting it into new economies, which took off. So I just think it would be great for us to think about kind of like what do we want to let go of, what do we want to do less of, and what do we want to kind of move in a different direction. So
we're going to move around. I know we've got some hands over there, so let's.
Thank you. So continuing on the new economy topic, I represent SCORAI to the New Economy Coalition. And for the last couple of years, they had these monthly webinars and very interesting people speaking and discussion and so on. And what I noticed is that everybody who participated in these conversations were the kind of people who are low consumers, right? They have elected simpler lives, smaller footprint, and it strikes me when I was listening to Philip that it's all connected. The neoliberal ideology is the cause of the economic problems that we have and the overconsumption that we have. Is that they actually are one and the same thing. People who, I'm not very articulate, I'm sorry, give me, I'm thinking it through as I'm talking, is that if we support the movements that are emerging under the umbrella of new economy, we will be supporting also the movement toward lower consumption. Right? So it's not only repackaging, but it's really getting at the root of things, right? So how does it apply to cities? I think that cities should somehow make it possible for these kinds of people to flourish in the cities. People who want to enter the other build an alternative economy. People who are thinking of different lifestyles. That, I think, is the big challenge of the cities, to have models of economic development that helps these movements to thrive in the cities and grow. And I don't think it has to take so long. As Vanessa said, there is a long latency period, and suddenly, here it is. So.
Let me hand this to Bill, or Jeffrey.
Oh, thank you. In considering how difficult this whole process of transforming the economy is, the last time I was thinking about this, I started looking back at one of the earlier efforts to transform the U.S. economy about 150 years ago, when our economy was based on a very repugnant system of slavery. That was part of our system of unsustainable production consumption, and the struggle to overcome that system was pretty bloody, pretty painful. And I don't think anybody wants to go off and get our own, register our own guns and get into that kind of battle. We want to kind of avoid it. Hopefully, we're more sophisticated. Which brings me to some of the kind of opportunities that we have here of organizing, having these kinds of discussions, having the communications, and having the kind of coming together of our imaginations to think of other ways to move forward. And Maurie talked about the coming together of the Sustainability Directors Network and SCORAI. It wasn't just UNEP, it was also a whole group of a lot of different kinds of stakeholder groups that came together in this roundtable. And one of and this was a kind of an innovation that we came up with, basically to take the government off the hot seat, because the government's is attacked by the right wing, saying, "Oh yeah, you know, you're adopting these sustainability policies that are all imports from Europeans, all those European socialists, and you're trying to impose it from this top down." So there's this whole kind of argument. And so it's difficult. It's difficult for governments to, we realize that it's difficult for governments being in the center here that are under attack, and to show this kind of leadership. And that's where you need other kinds of allies, like, say, the civil society groups who push the envelope, who can like speak out in ways that governments can't, in ways that businesses can't. And the same thing with progressive businesses. There's a lot of things that they can only go so far before they get roped in by their shareholders and, you know, liability suits, you know, if an executive director goes a little bit too far. So what we need is these alliances among all these groups, and especially with the leaders, the sustainability leaders within those stakeholder groups. Those are the people we really need to connect with, who also tend to be opinion leaders and tend to influence a wide range of different populations. So I think we need to be thinking about the kind of mechanisms where we can come together and form those kinds of alliances in creative ways, and you know, and avoid those sinkholes and you know, that whole, you know, navigating this whole swamp to transforming this economy.
So I know we've got Rosemary, Bill, and Neil. Anybody else who hasn't even really spoken yet? So let's go back here, and then if you want to hand that to Rosemary, and then we'll work that around the circle. But let's start right over here first.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to go right back to Bill and connect it with what you said. I think that those of us who sort of get what Bill is saying, you know, which I've been doing for 20, 25 years, I do actually think I like where Doug Holt was coming from, because I really think we've been out-strategized, out-marketed, out-framed. And so when I think about these, I mean, to me, what I've heard from Vanessa, let's use a sort of a highly sort of strategic mind to say, are there parts of this that we need to let go? Because we've been doing them for 20 years, and they're not strategic enough. We've been out-strategized in that area. And then so as these alliances that you're talking about, because some are more able to move forward change, and others may lose their jobs if they do. When we're doing that, how do we make sure that we kind of almost take that marketing mind and say, let's make sure that we categorize things. So if I were to sort of apply this to the sharing economy, there's certain categories. You know, the strategic approach that you want to take to Ubers and Lyft is a certain type of approach. Let's think through that. The strategic approach that we want to take, it almost comes right down to a very nuanced level at the neighborhood level. You know, what's the strategic approach that we take in one neighborhood that has a certain socioeconomic background or ethnocultural background, and how is it different from another neighborhood? And hopefully over time we learn. But I think, that's the thing that I keep on coming back to. Before we act and sink energy in various directions, let's take a moment to sit back and ask ourselves, is this actually going to move us in the right direction? Who do I need to be allied with to sort of make a sort of a strategic move? So I have to admit, I don't quite understand everything about where, you know, Doug Holt is coming from, but when I read his material, I go, oh yeah, you know, all of the messages that we're putting out there about you should not drink bottled water aren't actually resonating with you know, the soccer mom that I chat to on Saturday morning. I know we always go back to this, but I really do think that, you know, if they can persuade a Marlboro man gets people to smoke cigarettes, so the people who are doing the marketing campaigns around SUVs can get the most environmental person to feel that for safety reasons and because they can go out into the rugged outdoors will buy an SUV. And surely we need to even though we may have some concerns that we don't want to use the dark arts of marketing or whatever, I am tenacious about the outcome and agnostic about the means. So so that's all I want to say. Let's stretch our minds and go to other places if we need to get highly strategic about what we're doing, because we are, the business as usual folks are remarkably strategic and well funded and so on. Anyway, blah blah.
We're going to hear from Paul and Rosemary. You want to hand up to Jason, then we'll bring it back over.
Paul Schmiechen from the city of Denver. I guess I just want to add an observation on this. I think we have to be really careful about making the perfect the enemy of the good, because sometimes we just have to get out there and try stuff. And it's not going to always work, but we've just got to keep trying. But the critical piece of that is that you do have to build adaptive management into what you do. So you have to learn what you do, because we've implemented programs and we've gotten them wrong, but we've modified and we've learned from that and we've made them better. And I think back to the example about the critique of the bike sharing program as far as not reaching out to certain low-income neighborhoods. And we have that issue in Denver. But the bike share program was created initially as a commuter issue to solve the last mile problem. And we can go back and we can modify the bike share program, which we are doing to try to reach out to those neighborhoods. But it was difficult enough to put in the bike sharing program as it is currently configured. And so we will improve that, we will get it better. So I just need to kind of say that the world is really messy, especially down at the local government level. And sometimes you just have to get out there and start trying things and learning from what happened and then making things better. So it's a very entrepreneurial model. And sometimes we don't always have time for big strategy. We just need to get out there and try something that will affect, what we're trying to improve here.
I couldn't agree more. A perfect comment to follow. So some of you have probably read the work of an engineering historian named Henry Petrosky, professor emeritus at Duke. He's written books on the history of the paperclip, the history of the pencil, the history of the suspension bridge. And his main message about innovation is that we learn through failure. We figured out how to bend a piece of wire to attach a few pieces of paper together after about, many hundreds of patents being filed with the patent office before we figured out this is the right shape for the wire and this is what works. Suspension bridges, we went through quite a few catastrophic failures in suspension bridges before we got to suspension bridges that we think are an optimal design, but we're still working on it. And I think that the reason that's helpful to me as a way of thinking about what we're doing is that there was a vision for the designer of a paperclip, for every person who filed a patent, which there's a vision for, we want to attach a few pieces of paper together in a way that is reversible, that doesn't damage the paper, lightweight, resource efficient. And what interests me about what Eleni was describing for the New Economy Coalition is I absolutely agree that we need a lot of experimentation. We are not going to create the 10-year master plan for how we get to sustainability and then just tell everybody how to do it and get there. What will really happen is that we will envision a future and then millions of people will experiment in exactly the way you're describing. But the more we have a shared vision and the more we have a shared language for what it is we're doing and why we're doing it, the better able we are to learn about whether or not it was a success or failure. And that, for me, that's the reason why the naming of the first group that Eleni was managing was not such a success, and the naming of the second is more successful, because the New Economy language is a language that speaks to vision and what the future could be in a more inclusive way that allows for a broader network of experimentation and more diversity within that experimentation. But I absolutely agree that we need to be thinking about this as messy and acknowledge that we're not always going to even know if we're going in the right direction. But to me, one of the values the research community can bring is helping us to understand whether the experiments that we're undertaking are indeed moving us comprehensively in the direction we want to go. If our vision includes both reducing our greenhouse gas emissions to a manageable level and maintaining a just society and many other factors, a research community, I think, is well equipped to help us understand whether this experiment that we just did that really helped to reduce greenhouse gas emissions actually resulted in some unfortunate consequences somewhere else that means that it's not the perfect case study to replicate everywhere, but that we can learn from it and understand how to improve in the future.
Shannon.
Hi, everyone. So I can't believe I'm going to shill for the federal government, but here it is anyway. I've been with EPA less than a decade, which is a very short career for someone of my age. One of the things that EPA does beautifully is they publish all these things and they live on websites, but they're not developed in this kind of a community. So those resources are very well-kept secrets and perhaps not integrated at all at the level that we're talking about. But what I noticed when I came on board, two things have published. I call it the foundational paper or the pie chart paper. David talked to that yesterday, which takes the GHG accounting and shifts it into a materials, goods, and services. That foundational paper is what has given a lot of cities and states the portal into these kinds of conversations. It's grounded the efforts to look at consumption through a different kind of pie chart of the same data. So I want to put this invitation out loosely for us to think about. One, don't forget your federal partners as you go back to your communities. We are not at all empowered to deal with large issues. We have remarkable flexibility at the individual level to drive our own work. And so if there is a paper or data in some way that EPA can corral an intern, which is sort of who wrote that last paper, Josh Stolaroff, a very brilliant intern, we need to harness that in the federal government and to find some pocket within headquarters to be able to write the kind of research paper with data, whether it's sharing cities. I think that's a great portal. Because once that gets out there, then communities that never come to these places like Fresno and Spokane and Modesto, they just get to point that EPA sanctioned this paper. So please keep that in the framework and your thoughts. Thank you. Neil, James, and then Bill, and we'll see where we are with time.
Yeah, I just wanted to, this is really great discussion about this tension between having a strategy and then having lots of open kind of and distributed innovation. And you know, what we've done at Cheryl, we launched the Sharing Cities Network, it's been about a year and a half. And before that, we had an event in 2011. So we've been working on this idea of sharing in cities since May 2011, when we held maybe the first summit about it, Share San Francisco. And you know, we've had some success. What's really helped us and what has attracted some people and attracted attention is a kind of new narrative, this alternate narrative for a city, a sharing city. In some ways it's been co-opted, but also adopted by people like Julian and the city of Seoul, who has their Sharing City program. And so I think that on the one hand, like having a kind of new narrative is really powerful. A new story, that talks about a new development path for cities that isn't the neoliberal story of what a city is for, right? And then in our network, it's very loosely constructed at this point. So how our activists on the ground, we're working with about 60 cities, how they're 60 groups in 60 cities, how these grassroots activists are acting on this idea and working to create a sharing city. You know, they're all doing it in there's some patterns, but they're all doing it in a kind of different way. And so we're really learning from that. At the same time, you know, while we do have some great partners like New Dream and New Economy Coalition, and the list goes on, we are also under-resourced and it's not a robust network. We need, and it could be more diverse, not only class and ethnicity, but also in the professionals and skill mix. So what I'm really interested in is you know, finding people to work with who this is like something that sounds or seems or feels meaningful to them, who want to work together and maybe create a kind of strategy that within it, though, is this a possibility for lots of experimentation. So it's there's a looseness to it, not like a 10-year plan of the Soviets or something. You know what I mean? So anyway, that's my invitation.
What I meant is, I see each strategy as an experiment. I mean, there are going to be many, many strategies that we try. That's what we are experimenting with, is our strategies to get to the goal.
Great. Okay. James, and then Bill, and we'll check in.
2 points. One, very quick. I very much appreciate Eleni's comments about the evolution of the framing and having to move to new economy, which I agree with Jason's comments, maybe even more encompassing and so forth. But I do think it's an opportunistic approach, which is actually unfortunate but necessary, that I think cities and NGOs and even academics have to do in order to get the attention of funders and policymakers and so forth. So that's the quick one. The larger point builds on what Bill and Philip were talking about in terms of the systemic, integrated nature of the problems facing us, and the real urgency that I think Bill is calling out to all of us, particularly on the climate issue, and how if that is not addressed in the near term, a lot of other issues can be successfully addressed but will be kind of overwhelmed. And so I want to go back to a comment or a question I asked yesterday about the role of cities with respect to climate. And I know that almost every one of the practitioners here has a climate program, whether it's mitigation, adaptation, both, and so forth. But I think there's very little attention to the systemic nature of the climate issue, and what I'm very sympathetic to what Doug Holt talked about in terms of a very significant order of magnitude or more greater tax, if you will, on carbon. Even the existing regulatory carbon markets are $10 a ton or something. He's talking about 200. I have a colleague who talks about 400 is what's necessary to really achieve the kind of reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So my question, and it's really an open one, I'm agnostic on it at the moment, is do cities have a role in jointly advocating for, pushing for a higher level, i.e. national or global, tax, if you will, or cap and trade approach? Or should they continue to work, almost exclusively at the local level? And I realize it's not in either or, but there's very little attention, I think, to, if you will, organizing cities for the larger systemic approach on climate.
So we're going to go to Bill, but first a very quick response from Babe on that question.
On the question of what cities can do around carbon tax in particular. So here in Oregon, we have work that's going on that's been commissioned by our state legislature, and a city like Eugene was in a position to bring forward a resolution to our delegation to say, absolutely support this going forward at the state level. So if more cities are able to do that, we can see some action at the intermediate level, the state level, and certainly on the West Coast, as you know, that's where there's a lot of action around putting a price on carbon. So I would say absolutely yes, cities can come together to force statewide action.
Thank you. Bill.
As you all know, I'm an optimist about these things. You see, I'm optimistic because I believe that humans have the intellectual capacity and ingenuity to solve these problems. But a wise philosopher once said to me that you will not solve any problem that you do not understand. And I think we do not really understand this problem. We're talking a bit now about the systemic nature of the problem and so on and so forth. So for example, what we're dealing here with is a number of symptoms. Climate change is not a problem in and of itself. It's symptomatic of something else. Biodiversity loss is not a problem in and of itself. It's symptomatic of something else. The collection of plastics in the oceans is not a problem in and of itself. It's a symptom of something else. And I could go on. My fundamental point is that we have framed as a species a vision of ourselves that is fundamentally incompatible with the way in which natural systems function. And yet we have become the single major geological force on the planet and the single largest consumer species in every ecosystem on Earth. So what we have here is a fundamental human ecological dysfunction. The human system is ecologically dysfunctional in the sense that the way we have conceived of the human system does not map to the biophysical reality in which we find ourselves. The two systems are fundamentally incompatible. They need not be, but they are. The symptoms of this incompatibility are the emergent phenomena that we call climate change and biodiversity loss and so on and so forth. These things are the inevitable emergent properties of trying to integrate a human system which is a product of mind. We socially construct our way of being in the world with a system that operates according to biophysical and physical laws which are immutable. And so long as we have a human system that is functioning within a host system in which the fundamental properties of the two are totally different, it ain't gonna work. So we've talked a lot about framing, we've talked a lot about systems, and we have to bring these two concepts together because we need to socially construct a new reality, a new way of seeing ourselves. You talked about the story. We need a new story. Humans operate out of stories, not out of reality. We socially construct how we think about things, and we act out of that, not out of the reality. But if the way we think is a good map of the reality, we're on a safe course. So what we're really engaged in here, and in meetings like this everywhere, is in trying to reconstruct a vision of ourselves, of human culture, of society, of cities, that conforms to the biophysical principles, the biophysical laws that function in nature in ways that don't lead us astray. No system in nature, for example, grows indefinitely. Yet the fundamental principle underpinning the entire global economy and every national economy is perpetual material growth. I'm sorry. As long as you have any system based on that fundamental principle, it will fail in the real biophysical world in which we find ourselves. Climate change, we could solve that as a problem, but if you solve it by finding substitutes for the energy supply that continue our growth dynamic, we'll continue to pollute the seas, erode the soils, deplete biodiversity, and so on and so forth. You cannot tackle this problem one symptom at a time. We need to reframe our relationship in ways that are fundamentally compatible with the biophysical reality within which we find ourselves. That's our real challenge. Now, people talk framing without really understanding how profoundly important this is. How many of you have heard of the Powell Memo? Sigh. Go online, look up Lewis Powell Memorandum, P-O-W-E-L-L. In 1970, Lewis Powell, then a corporate lawyer, wrote a memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce stating that the environmental movement, the women's movement, etc., were all threats to the American way of life. And he said the only way to deal with these threats is to reconstruct political dialogue in this country in ways that favor corporate values. And you will do this by coming together as corporations to found think tanks, to purchase departments of economics, to to fund chairs of economics that teach Philip's neoliberal paradigm. We will frame the way we move forward in the United States around the notion of perpetual growth, around the notion that there's no such thing as community, around the notion of individual action. Somebody mentioned, Julian, I think, that everybody, we're all talking about sloughing off these issues onto the individual. It's not an individual problem. Sustainability is a collective problem that requires collective solutions. There's at least 2 papers that show that if individuals did everything they could as individuals, it would make between 2 and 7% difference. That ain't going to cut it. This is a collective problem. We do need that $200 or $400 carbon tax as part of a package of reforming these issues. Anyway, the Powell memo essentially said, put up a bunch of think tanks and make sure you do not lose sight of the language within which we discuss politics in this country. And now, it wasn't the only factor, but it triggered a whole series of events that led to the foundation of the Cato Institute, the Heartland Institute, the foundation for this, that, and whatever else, that everything is good about America. And it has captured the way in which we think in this country and in my country and increasingly globally today. The right wing has been enormously successful, as several of you have said, in outframing us. And they've had millions of dollars to do it, but they've created a mental mindset in which people now vote against their own interests, for heaven's sakes. That's an incredibly powerful construct. So what am I saying? We have socially constructed a human enterprise that is fundamentally incompatible with the nature of biophysical reality. It's also, by the way, fundamentally incompatible with real human behavior, because it causes all the social problems that we've been talking about, and I've been given the signal I can't go on. This is obviously a big topic. I'm just pleading with us to get systematic, to recognize that we're dealing with a much bigger problem than the individual symptoms that we tend to focus on, because again, a social construct is this pattern of thinking which is reductionist and breaks things apart. We don't tend to think systematically because we haven't been trained to do so. So we need to reconstruct our way of thinking about the constructs in which we are operating, and to create an economy. A new economy must be a no-growth economy, in fact, a smaller economy than the one we have now in material terms, but one which is much more equitable in its distribution of goods and services among the human population. Because if we don't have that, we'll have civil strife, and that will take us down just as rapidly as ecological deterioration. So we've got to focus on those 2 prongs within a whole new systemic way of seeing ourselves in relation to reality. Thank you for your patience, but I had to get that off my chest.
So we're going to hear from Ashley, and then we're going to hear from me.
So this is quick, and this is more of a near-term solution we can hopefully collaborate on, since we have a lot long-term looking ahead. So something that Jenny Moore brought up at a table yesterday was, how do we look at existing policies? We're all orbiting this giant hairball of structure and policies that are creating a lot of perverse incentives. So, stand up, sure. So how do we look at policy alignment to achieve the sustainable future with the existing policies and structures at the city and state level? And one opportunity I see is leveraging academic resources through either classes or maybe internship clinics that focus on a few states and cities and look at what are those perverse incentives with minimum parking requirements. Or a near example that I just came across is the waste hauling industry wants to help with recovery efforts. Well, there's no incentive for that, but currently we're subsidizing food banks to buy healthy food because it's not what's being donated, when maybe those haulers could partner with recovery organizations and start to fund them. So how can we use our existing systems in a more near-term way? And what I like about using academia to make those perverse incentives more visible is it allows grassroots organizations to start to put more pressure on cities and states to create more political feasibility in ultimately addressing those incentives.
Thank you, Ashley. We're at time for this.